All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and good evening to Daniel Levy, who is graciously joining us from London at 5 o'clock your time, I guess. It's noon here in Washington, and we've got early risers on the West Coast joining us. And we are the day after what some in our little world we're calling A Day, July 1, the day on which the process of annexation was permitted by the coalition agreement in Israel to start moving forward. And we, with great prescience, decided to schedule a call with Daniel for the day after in order to discuss what should be done now that Israel has annexed the West Bank. So, Daniel, for those who don't know, on this call, we're joined by about, it looks like over 100 participants on Zoom. We've got a bunch of folks on Facebook. There will be a whole bunch who will watch this after the fact. You were one of the founders of J Street. You and I, 15 years ago, began to talk about this need for a voice in American politics and American policymaking that would try to balance out the political equation and change the dynamics around this issue, so there wasn't one set of voices from the right center that claimed to speak for the entirety of American Jewry. And we felt 15 years ago that one of the great constraints on trying to make progress on this issue was the essentially the fact that American policy was held hostage to American Jewish public opinion and politics, and a right of center, Israel right or wrong politics. And here we are 15 years later, a lot has changed. And so I wanted to just give you a chance at the very beginning to comment a bit on the 15-year sweep of this. And what do you see from now a few thousand miles away of how things have changed over here?
Well, other than our physical appearance, Jeremy.
Right, exactly. No gray in our beards 15 years ago.
Well, first of all, I've got my Zoom shirt on, so we can get this going. As you're saying that, I'm thinking that something very interesting has happened. If I reflect on one thing, which is that what J Street set out to do has, in one respect, been achieved, which is, I think, the conversation in the US has been pulled in a different direction. And, certainly the center of gravity within the Democrat Party is not what it was 15 years ago. I would suggest that the center of gravity within American public opinion is different as well, because although, and by the way, I think that's probably reflected across a range of issues, although you have one of the main two political parties deeply committed to an even more extreme vision, I don't think that necessarily holds for the entire, the entire GOP electorate previously. I don't know what kind of electorate they'll have this November. At the same time as that has happened, that debate has moved the center of gravity in the Democratic Party. There's serious political forces to the left of J Street. We saw the letter from AOC, Sanders, Rashida Ilhan, others earlier this week. The center of gravity in Israel has continued in a very unilinear direction. That was a tension and a fault line, but it has been stretched. Yeah. To
a breaking point. We're at a breaking point, possibly.
Yeah. And we were just, we were just discussing just for a minute before we came on that you had the call yesterday as J Street. And there were some Israelis on that call, and the ability for, the people who were probably the obvious partners then to understand that journey and they would need to self-reflect and also understand the journey they've gone on, which I'm not sure they're doing. So I think for me, that's the most interesting thing, which, makes your life, I imagine, much more difficult. Makes the ability to achieve the actual end goal of J Street in terms of the reality over there much more challenging. But one looks at at a desperate situation when it comes to achieving peace, achieving an end of occupation, achieving dignity and rights for both peoples, and that looks further away than ever. But one looks at the realities in the United States, and it's a very different picture. And it's
right. And the conversation we're going to have today, which is really very much, about what American policy should be. What should American policy be? Not July 2nd or July 6th, but I'm thinking American policy going forward, 2021, a new administration, a new decade. Where is the thrust of American foreign policy, given what is likely to happen in the next few days? So that's the conversation we're going to have. I want to further credential Daniel. I assume that people do know Daniel, but Daniel's been at the U.S. Middle East Project. He's been at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He's been at the Century Foundation. He's been with the Geneva Initiative. He's been at the what was it? The ECF. What was that? The Economic Cooperation
Foundation. Yes.
Just a whole at the right hand of Yossi Beilin during many of the meaningful talks that were going on, as well as then the model talks that led to the Geneva Accord. So Daniel's really been at the center of all of this for now more than 2 decades. And I want to just start with an analysis of today. We'll talk about where we're headed, but I'd love to get, and I'm sure other people would be curious, A, why did nothing happen yesterday so far? And B, what's your sense of what is likely to happen? What will Netanyahu actually do when the decision is made and action is taken?
I am still expecting there to be a move on annexation. July was always random. November is not random. November or January, but
right.
In many respects, I see it as more as November. Having said that July was random, there is a dynamic in play. The longer Netanyahu waits now, the more pressure he invites. So I do think that the further we drift into the summer, I think it will circle back. There'll be other moments, but I think Netanyahu has a problem that he has built for himself. My read on what happened in the lead up to yesterday is this, Jeremy. I think that there was a piece of this that was predictable. And I guess I want to start by saying this was an internal Israeli political dynamic and decision, which does not mean that all the work that was done on the outside was irrelevant. I think it was marginal in terms of its impact on the Israeli decision-making. I think its potential significance is in the fact that it could engage people, it could mobilize people, it could hopefully get some people on record going further than they were willing to and drawing some of that out. But I think what happened in Israel is that one thing was predictable, which was there was going to be a fight within the right, within the settler movement, within Netanyahu's base. That looked different the moment he made the coalition that he made, because he has an opposition to his right outside of the coalition. Naftali Bennett's Bayit Yehudi, unless we forget what a racist, expansionist thug he is, Yvette Lieberman.
I never forget that. I never forget that, don't worry.
Yvette Lieberman, no, because people have this tendency to say, well, Lieberman, he could be, no, Lieberman is Lieberman. And he was standing on a hill overlooking Khan al-Ahmar yesterday, a Palestinian area that was due to be demolished, reminding people that Bibi promised to demolish it. He hadn't demolished it yet. He hadn't done annexation yet.
And just by the way, just for those on the call or watching later, Khan al-Ahmar is a village that J Street was very, very involved in bringing to international attention, and its survival and the prevention of demolition is another example of the kind of thing that happens when international voices are raised. I think it was the spotlight on that village that prevented Netanyahu from moving forward. And even if Lieberman were to be the prime minister, I think the international spotlight is too bright on that particular village. So, but anyhow.
I agree with that. I agree with that take on what happened with Khan al-Ahmar. So number one, there's a fight inside the settler movement. This is the monster that was created over many, many years. Netanyahu contributed tremendously to it, that almost nothing short of full annexation, full-blown apartheid, perhaps full-blown ethnic cleansing is good enough for a cohort of the Israeli right. The second thing, which was less predictable, was that this would happen to coincide with another wave of significant COVID infection.
Right.
And so I think Gantz, blue and white, have been flailing around looking for where to pin their mast in terms of, they don't really want annexation, but they don't want to be against it. They'd committed to it. So they first of all came up with the laughable line that we're in favor as long as it's done with regional agreement and coordination, which is a way of saying no, but if you really want to say no, say no. And so this gave them a hook for their opposition, that this is an absolute distraction. No one needs annexation when we have to worry about COVID. The third factor is something that, of course, everyone globally is paying attention to and repositioning, recalibrating their positions according to, which is just how dramatic your president is tanking in the opinion polls. So, nothing's a done deal. November is November.
Believe it. Just making clear for everybody on this call, do not take your eyes off that work that needs to be done for November. This is absolutely vital.
So this is a snapshot in July, but everyone is paying attention, of course. And everyone is paying attention to how difficult that path to a win is looking like it's becoming. Now, I don't think that makes Netanyahu fundamentally change the decision. I think that Netanyahu will begin to look weak. And I think Netanyahu has a problem because, the guy's 14 months out from ostensibly, according to the coalition agreement, standing down as prime minister. And if he doesn't do this, he will look weak. So I think he's looking for a way of doing this. I tend to think that if he resolves the first piece of that puzzle, which is the internal problem within the base, within the right, then he can move forward. And I say that with a couple of things in mind. Number one, I think that the arguments that Kushner and Trump are going to prevent annexation, sometimes you literally need to kind of pull yourself out of Alice in Wonderland to believe what you're hearing. Because this morning on Israel, in the Israeli media, one of the things was just how Israel is going to have to make concessions to the Palestinians if they're going to do annexation. What is the concession? To hand over to Area A or B some of the existing land of Palestinians within the occupied territory. So I don't actually think that that's a problem. I think it's a problem as long as Netanyahu doesn't have his ducks lined up, because until he has his ducks lined up, he can't send Friedman, Sheldon Adelson, and the evangelicals into battle. Right. Because they have their direct line into the settlers. And if the settlers are saying to Sheldon, to Friedman, to the evangelicals, and you've seen this reflected in some of the back and forth, guys, this isn't good enough. Until Bibi has those ducks lined up, he can't take this to the White House. Once he does, I think he can take it to the White House. That may not happen. I expect it will happen. I do not think that the whining, and I call it mostly whining, coming out of Europe, which is to say, please don't, Israel, without being able to spell any consequences. I don't think that has had a significant impact. I don't think what we've heard from the region has had a particularly significant impact. I do not think that Netanyahu significantly fears a Biden administration and that is driving his considerations. May do so the closer we get to November. I think it may well do so between November and January. So yeah, that's where I think we are.
So, let's lay down one marker, which is something that comes up a lot from the J Street world and from others. Whatever the decision is, and I tend to think there will be some move. I mean, I don't see any way that Bibi goes through this entire process and comes out at the other end without having actually annexed something. And whether it is 1 inch or whether it's the entire West Bank, the same basic principles have to apply. There's no such thing as being partially annexed. You know, this is you're either violating international law, kicking out the underpinnings of the global world order, or you're not. You know, this is an on and off switch. And that means that there has to be a package of responses that people are ready to rally around on the day after. And the purpose of this conversation between you and me, and I'm going to definitely engage with the questions that people are typing into the Q&A, and I'm getting some side comments in some other chats. I definitely want to bring other folks into this. But the question is, what should the United States do? And I want to define the question more precisely, because there are a set of things that people can call for that feel really good to say out loud and to call for. And then there's the kinds of suggestions that might actually become American policy. And there are the kinds of things that might actually stand a chance of being passed in Congress and signed into law. And sometimes it's really helpful to create the space for things that might actually happen, to have a set of voices that are calling for things that are a little bit more out there and that don't really have a chance. And I think it's really important as we tease out different items that we're going to walk through on our list, so we sort of distinguish what actually has a real chance of becoming American policy. So I want to really walk through some of those items with you, you know, get your thoughts on things that people are putting on the table. And, you know, let's see what we can construct in terms of a package. So I was reading a Twitter thread from Elon Goldenberg today. Elon, for those who don't know, first of all, he's done a lot of these sort of things with us for J Street. He's very much somebody we have a good relationship with. He was Martin Indyck's chief of staff in the last go round of the peace process work for John Kerry. And Elon argued in his Twitter thread that recognition by the United States of the state of Palestine is the single most important thing that a new administration could do, and a game changer. And he has about a 15 tweet thread that I won't walk through. But the idea of US recognition of the state of Palestine in order to keep the notion of ultimately two states alive, and also to try in some way to level the playing field, is something that many people have put out there before. So let's start with that one. I'm curious your reaction to that and whether you think it's relevant and has an actual impact on the course of this conflict.
Yeah, and I think let's preface everything we're going to talk about here with the following. Annexation is not the problem. Annexation is a symptom. And in that respect, Netanyahu has been facilitated in creating a win-win, because somehow, and I'm not saying this is the J Street position, somehow so much of the conversation feels as if occupation is okay, annexation is a step too far. The problem is the denial of Palestinian freedoms and rights, disenfranchisement, occupation, inequality. A symptom is the possibility of annexation. The alternative to annexation, if annexation doesn't happen, it's not more occupation. The letter from the UAE ambassador there in Washington, DC, was actually a slap in the face to peace and to a future agreement. Because what Ambassador Tabi, intentionally or otherwise, was saying was, we'll normalize more as long as you don't annex. Occupation is just fine. And the idea that the alternative to annexation is the Trump plan, which is the nonsense that Gantz has been pursuing, unfortunately, is a terrible way of looking at this. So it feels a bit like a win-win, that Bibi should be rewarded if he doesn't annex, that if we don't annex, it means we can be back in the great space of advancing the Trump plan. I think that's important to set on the record. I think Ilan
Let me I want to just pick up on that and say very clearly something too that came up in the Q&A and that is a constant J Street question. Occupation is the problem. And we as J Street, as we fight against annexation, are not taking our eye off that ball. And in fact, one of the most important things we've been pushing with the Democratic Party as it's heading into its platform process is that the Democratic Party needs to make sure that word isn't erased from the vocabulary of the discussion of this conflict. And I think one of the things that we've seen over the last month plus, as we've had these protests on the streets and we've been really engaging around issues of race and police brutality, if you don't name the problem, if you don't put on the table the structural racism in the United States and get to some of the real tough conversations about decades and centuries that have set up a situation that we're in today, where an entire community just can't get up onto the same level as the rest of the community. If you don't name that, you can't address the symptoms of the problem. And so similarly here, I think for J Street and all of us who are working on this, we have to name the occupation. We have to make sure that that is not allowed to be put to the side. And somehow in the course of our fighting for, no annexation, we lose sight of that. And when we talk to, about what the policies need to be going forward, it isn't simply an anti-annexation set of policies. It is an anti-occupation set of policies. And I think that's a really important point from a J Street point of view, and I wanted to follow. But let's get back to recognition of the state of Palestine.
Right. And let's pick up the point you just made, which is a really important one. And I think Ilan was trying to come up with, Ilan Goldenberg, whose tweet you referred to, was trying to come up with something constructive. I disagree with his suggestion. I disagree that recognition is the thing we should be doing. I'll refer to specifically his argument, and then I'll refer more broadly to the issue. What Ilan proposes is not recognizing final borders. And I think that's A, natural when it comes to the act of recognition in this context, but B, super problematic. And I'll come back to this, but I think as long as this remains a question of real estate and not a question of values and equality, we are on a hiding to nothing. Our side continues to lose. Occupation continues to win. So the absence of being able to delineate borders, I think also means, okay, let's triangulate. Let's split the difference between the Trump plan and previous proposals. Ilan suggests that it would send a powerful signal by the US of the recognition of Palestinian rights. I don't see how this is recognizing any right other than the right to statehood, but you still haven't defined what a state is or where it would be. So I do not think this is, and I think this more importantly is a Palestinian position, that this is not recognizing something that has no defined attributes of sovereignty, let alone borders, is not what Palestinians are looking for when it comes to their right.
All right, so let's stipulate then that you don't like that idea. So let's put that one aside.
Let me just dig a tiny bit deeper on this, because it comes into...
I have a whole list, though, so I just want to warn you.
I realize, but it does come into this kind of diagram that you set out for us, which is an important diagram, which is, along one axis is the possible, and along another axis is the impactful.
Right.
This may be at the outer edge of the possible, but I think it's right down in the nether regions of the impactful. Other countries, America is not any old country, I recognize. Others have recognized Palestine. I think it's a moment, it's a symbolic moment, and then the Israelis can dismiss it and move on, unless it carries with it particular stipulations as to what the recognition would mean, and no one is talking about that when they're talking about recognition. And finally, I think it sends the signal to the Palestinian leadership, you're doing great. Keep carrying on with your symbolic wins. And I think that's the worst signal we could send to Ramallah right now.
So we'll put that one down in the bottom quadrant where where you've discarded it of that 2x2 grid, which is a great framework for us to talk about these things. So let me raise another one, which is the question of holding Israel accountable for its actions in international bodies. This is something that the Obama administration debated a lot in the years. We were tracking this over the 2008 to 2016. The final act of the Obama administration on this issue was the settlement resolution 2334 at the Security Council. And the question is a piece of an American policy recalibration of America's blanket diplomatic protection for Israel in international bodies from accountability for its actions over the Green Line. This is not to say, I want to say this clearly, there is a disproportionate focus on the state of Israel in the context of the international human rights bodies. The percentage of resolutions, the percentage of time is disproportionate given how much goes wrong around the world. And there is a bias and a problem. But that having been said, there are institutions and there is an international rule of law. And do you think that a new American approach on this issue should have a different approach to the way the US provides protection for the state of Israel in international institutions?
Let's take half a step back, Jeremy, because the premise behind this, and I think many other things that we might tee up and discuss here, I think is an important premise. And I think it's important to establish that. And that is that it would be wonderful to imagine a realizable scenario where a visionary Israeli leader comes to the fore and Israel summons from within itself the gumption to take a different approach, apply a different set of values, and to come to a very different resting place with the Palestinians. One of the reasons, a lot of the reasons for that not happening are very internally driven. But one of the reasons we have seen slippage in precisely the opposite direction, one of the reasons what we talked about at the very beginning in terms of the direction in the US one way, the direction, or at least in the Democratic Party, direction is that for many, many years, people like you and me, more importantly, the leaders of the liberal-ish center-left camp in Israel said, whatever else we say about the Palestinians, we can't get away with it. The world will not allow us. And I attribute an entire psychological phenomenon to the editorial and op-ed page in Haaretz, the pariah derangement syndrome, where they believe that any moment now, Israel, none of that has happened.
The diplomatic tsunami alert that was supposed to be sounding, is that one?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the Israeli public have been told, we can't get away with it, bad things will happen. The Israeli public have experienced that not only is that not the case, but that Netanyahu has taken Israel, and this is true. Sometimes Netanyahu wins because there's a grain of truth in what he says, that Israel's relations have improved. So the premise for all of this is that if you want to free up, if you want to create space in Israel for the public and the political class to revisit the journey they are on, to revisit the decisions they have taken, something needs to give. And the assumption is that as long as it is cost-free, as long as there is impunity, as opposed to consequences and accountability, they will continue on this path. Okay. That having been said, the particular issue of in international fora. Look, from what we understand, I don't know the veracity of this, Biden was not a big fan of doing 2334, which was the UN Security Council resolution in the dying embers, the lame duck period of the Obama administration, where America abstained. I would like to think that one of the things we will see out of a Biden administration, if that is where we are come January, is a full throttled embrace of multilateralism. Is to one of the things we will most definitively turn a page on is that particular component of America turning away from the world, of American carnage. I would like to think that this can be part of it. And I think it could be impactful. So I'm putting this in a much healthier place on the ground.
On the quadrants of...
On the quadrants. Now, there's two caveats here. Number one is, there is sometimes a mistaken assumption that that the rest of the world is straining at the leash to apply itself to the Palestine question. If only America would not be pulling back, you would have moves all the time to apply meaningful, legitimate sanctioning to Israeli violations of international law, international norms, human rights, etc. I don't think that's an accurate reading of the rest of the world. It wasn't before COVID put everything else in the shade in terms of priorities. So I think what you would actually require, which makes it more challenging, but I don't think beyond the realms of the possible, what you would actually require, just as this administration and administrations in the past, but this administration with greater gusto, I would argue, has been slamming countries very hard, very aggressively, to take as egregious as possible a position internationally against Palestinian rights and international law. The Biden administration
hopefully we will get Daniel back.
And I think we have to bear that in mind, because that's going to be tough.
We lost a few sentences of your thoughts there, just so you know, but
sorry. So what I'm saying is that I think a Biden administration might have to actively encourage people to move forward. The other caveat is the area where this appears to most impact Israeli calculations is the ICC, the International Criminal Court, where the question of whether Palestine is justiciable is being considered. It seems to be leaning in that direction. Trump has launched a relentless assault on the court in general, but specifically on our issue. And that would be the most meaningful place. Whether that is a politically viable place to go or not, I think is challenging, but I think it's interesting.
So let me continue down the path. The premise behind the first two is really this notion that there's been no cost that Israel has been able to proceed with, the sense that no matter what it does, the United States will let it do and not impose anything. And it leads people naturally to the question of dollars and cents. The question of the aid package. The $3.8 billion a year that has been committed through a memorandum of understanding that was entered into by the Obama-Biden administration in 2018 that covers the 10 years through 2028, and then has been legislatively endorsed, I think each year, by overwhelming majorities of both houses of Congress and both parties. And the question from many is, well, wouldn't something related to those dollars be the most effective, if you're putting it on your impactful scale? Wouldn't that be the most impactful? If you were to threaten in some way that $3.8 billion would not land in the bank account of the state of Israel every year, that somehow that would have an impact on its behavior. And then on your practicality scale, the question of whether or not there's any chance that some discussion of this could actually lead to a change in the way that America approaches aid. So I want to put on the table a very important distinction that I've been trying to drive. It was yesterday in our Zoom with Chris Van Hollen and Jan Schakowsky, and it's been in some of the conversations we've been having, a distinction between questioning the level of aid and the overall package and whether that amount of money should be cut or preconditioned before it's provided, or whether there is a more likely to be implemented, perhaps slightly less impactful, but still impactful approach, which would say the 3.8 billion is agreed. We're not going to go back on that agreement. It was, Joe Biden, part of the administration that made it. It's hard to imagine him cutting it, but you can imagine a situation in which the United States and policymakers and legislators and people administering funds could put a lot greater scrutiny into how that money is used. What is the purpose that it's going for? Is any of the money being used in settlements? Is it being used for annexation? Is it being used for demolitions? Is it being used for detention of child prisoners? There's a whole range of things one can look at, and just the act of scrutiny and reporting and transparency and accountability begins to have an impact. So I'm curious if you have your opinions on this and where you fall on that scale of things.
Thoughts never crossed my mind, Jeremy.
Really, I'm glad to bring you up to speed. This is a conversation that actually is happening here in the United States, Daniel. I know it might be shocking to hear.
It's really good to know. So And look, I think there's a question which you haven't gone into, and I don't think we should go into, which is American priorities, domestic versus global, within the global arena, not least with the economic challenges that this unprecedented situation regarding COVID lead us to. Does that create an on-ramp for a conversation about this stuff that might otherwise not exist? I am told no by the bubble dwellers, the blob dwellers in Washington. I simply pose the question, which I still think might be pertinent. I think the most important issue regarding the aid is the signal that would be sent by anything that challenges the automaticity, by anything that puts, well, first of all, because it's implicit in what you said, but it's important to draw out, Jeremy. First of all, just the very fact that anyone would be following where the money is spent, what it can be spent on and what not. Does Lehi apply to Israel? The idea that Israel has to give an accounting of how that money is spent beyond something incredibly pro forma already adds something different into the relationship.
Right. I think people don't understand enough that this is the least scrutinized money allocated by the Congress of the United States each year. There is, compared to every other aid program, every other country's assistance package, this money has the least oversight and scrutiny of anybody else. And so just one of the things you might begin to say is just at least apply the scrutiny you're applying to every other country to this country.
So I think, I mean, as you say, I think there are two things you achieve off the bat within any variation on the theme that you put in front of us, Jeremy. Number one is the signal that's sent. And I think that signal is sustainable over a longer period than, for instance, recognition. I think that the importance of that signal is sustainable. Secondly, as you say, the nature of the US-Israel bilateral relationship is so dense, it's so intense, that this gives you some leverage in multiple conversations, especially between the security establishments. So you've achieved something already with those two. You see, if I zoom out a minute, the way I see this, and this is what I would urge people to have in mind as we think about what one would want from a Biden administration. We are in a place where, whether it was justifiable according to the realities on the ground, or whether it was Pollyannish and desperately naive, there was some thinking under Clinton that, you know, maybe one could just get a deal and be done with it. Occupation over, 2 states. In the twilight time of W, there was some thinking, maybe we could do it. Annapolis, Olmert, Abbas. I'm not sure there was ever a moment with Obama, but there was at least a hope that you could perhaps establish the parameters and lay the dead cat at the door of the recalcitrant party, which would be Netanyahu. If Biden comes in, he will inherit a reality that is predicated on building blocks. And the challenge for all of us is to design the building blocks that can build the most robust, likely successful path away from where we are towards getting rights for both people, achieving a place that's very different from the place we're in now. When it comes to the particular, and I think there are things that one can do on that, where it comes to the particulars, I think initially you'd have to send the signal when it comes to aid. At some stage, you would have to scale up and escalate, and you'd have to put the total amount on the table. But what I think we should be aiming at is putting a number of things in place which might shake up some of the stasis, some of the current direction of travel amongst Israelis, and also in different ways, which we may touch on briefly, amongst Palestinians. And so I do think that adding what you said to the mix could do that. Obviously it impacts where on the diagram it comes in terms of the possibility, which model one goes to.
We could probably use some visual aids. Next time
Exactly.
I'm going to have a little, one of the boxes on the screen is going to be a little chart, and we'll plug in.
Maybe Madeline or Nate can kind of
Right, exactly. Maybe we can figure out how to do that in real time. But so yeah, no, I think that the building blocks concept, and one of the things that I'm getting at by throwing out a series of different pieces is this notion that perhaps the approach needs to be a package. It needs to have a whole series of things, because some things are going to fly, some things are not going to fly, some things have more impact, some have less. But as you put the whole of the package together, you are changing the fundamental basis on which this issue is approached. And perhaps it's the combination of all of it that allows the mindsets to shift and allows us to move in a different direction. So, I think the building block analogy is a good one. I do want to, we have about 15 minutes or so left. There's a few questions that are coming in and a few more things I want to touch on. Several people in the Q&A are raising questions that go to something I know you have strong opinions on. Not that I don't know if there's anything you don't have strong opinions on, but this one I know you do, which is diplomacy and whither diplomacy, right? And some people want to know whether or not some international format, and the P5+1 comes up, that's how one approached Iran. There's the quartet, perhaps there's a, Q4+2 or something, that one can come up with some kind of a international multilateral forum in which this issue would be better addressed than in the bilateral approach with US mediation. And I know you and I both know the only thing we absolutely will jump out of our basement windows is if we hear the frame of the new administration being bilateral talks mediated by the United States so the two parties can talk directly. This is not the formula for success. So in terms of thinking, though, about diplomacy, all of these things we've laid out so far are trying to unilaterally push and change Israeli behavior. But ultimately, if you do want to get out of this hole, there has to be some form of negotiation, diplomacy, and ultimately some framework diplomatically for getting out of this. And so the question is, what should diplomacy under a next administration look like? And is there a set of proposals that one should be putting forward now to a new administration?
So I think it's really important that overhyped, overambitious negotiations framed as peace talks are not cost-free. Their failure, and if you go into them in circumstances where, the heavens have just opened remarkably. I hope it doesn't affect the Wi-Fi, but I'm got this torrential downpour outside for me. So if I look distracted, that's what it is.
Is it a good sign? Does that mean that our ideas are meeting favor and rain has come to, boost the economy, or is it a bad sign about...
or just cloud movement and the atmosphere as a third option,
perhaps science.
Yes. So the idea that under circumstances where the odds are so stacked against anything, so I would very much downplay that. It's about building towards something. That's also what I mean by building blocks. And again, I don't think that others are chomping at the bit. I know that the Palestinians have suggested this other format. But when I think about diplomacy, I think about some of the things we've been talking about already, the signals that you send in the international arena. I think about some of the things that one should be doing vis-a-vis the Palestinians. I think Palestinian unity is crucial. I think that is not being prevented by the outside, but we should be sending signals to encourage that. I think you have to take people out of their comfort zone. You have to create a different calculus before you can get people back in a room to have negotiations. I think there's a lot of diplomacy that can be done over Gaza, for instance. And Gaza gets very forgotten in the annexation debate. But in some respects, at least, we're talking about trying to replicate in Gaza, replicate in the West Bank, in these tiny islands of Palestinian trapped mini authority, what you have in Gaza. But look, first of all, I would be happy for the US to act more in concert with others to create some kind of a contact group, but not with a view to prematurely going back to negotiations. I think there are signals that should be sent, specific policies that should be taken, but I think this is about, let things percolate. First of all, if Trump's not there, let the removal of the Trump plan, the removal of annexation or the derecognition, let some of the other signals we've been sending, let that percolate within the Israeli political class. Give it a bit of time, see what the dynamic is. And I think I'm also leaning towards making a broader point, which is, I would almost say that our starting point has to be a narrational shift in terms of how we talk about and think about things. And I think policies flow from that. So I tend to think that as long as this is a real estate argument, we can't make progress. But I also think as long as we're premising what we want to achieve on separation and demography, then the whole issue can't capture the moral high ground and can't shift the entire conversation. And you said earlier, Jeremy, what's going on in America today, the structural racism, the problems that a place stores up for itself. And I see that fault line on the kind of what remains of the liberal progressive peace camp in Israel today. For those who are a bit in the weeds, and I think a lot of people who are following this are,
right. Well, if 137 people have stuck with us for an entire hour of this conversation, they better be in the weeds.
Then they probably would know their Darkei news from their Omdim B'Yachad. But if they don't, is your approach to annexation to highlight, as the commanders for Israel's security do, what this does to the ability to do separation and demography? Or do you, as others have done, talk about the moral values that this is an affront to, that this is antithetical to? And I kind of feel that that's the journey we have to go on before we circle back and get too in the policy weeds, which... No,
it's an interesting point. I mean, one of the things that I think is important is to recognize that different arguments speak to different people. And I think that the question of which of those strands of the narrational, change you go with, it depends on who you're speaking to. And I think that the arguments that a Darkenu or a Commanders for Israel Security make are critical to those who've grown up with a narrative of the state of Israel as a safe haven and the security narrative being the most important, and everybody's out to get you, and the state is there to provide safety and security, and therefore your first arguments are going to be, what does a step do that you're proposing to take to the safety and security of the state that's supposed to protect the Jewish people? And I think it is not an either or choice. And I think that would be a mistake to abandon and to downplay the importance of some of the security narrative to some of the audiences that need to be constantly educated about why this is the wrong path. Why are we going down the wrong path right now? And the moral argument is not going to work for a lot of the folks who need to be brought along for there to be the political basis for policy change. Moral argument.
Given the timeline I see this according to, I differ with you on that, and I'll go back to your America analogy. As long as you see the people of color in the US, as long as you see the Black community through a securitized, militarized, then you can only end up with varying degrees of the kind of policing we see, of mass incarceration. As long as you see this through the prism of security, you end up with where we are in Israel. So like I say, that there was a perceived utility. For some people, it was where they were coming from. For others, there was a perceived utility, which is what you're saying, Jeremy, to kind of sewing those differing strands together, and boom, we could deliver under Rabin, maybe under Barak, maybe under Olmert, even maybe. I think the jury is in, and that approach has failed. And whether I'm right or not, it's pretty clear that we're not in any short to medium term resolution here. So I think the circling back and rediscovering what it is we're actually fighting for is a fundamental starting point. But I'm sure there's other things we need to discuss before we finish.
So, well, I mean, one of the things that's come up, and this is a series of folks and people listening in today asking these questions who lean in our direction, right? And who want to see things move in the right direction. And there's several questions about, well, what are you asking of the Palestinians? It is, even for ears of people involved in the J Street world, it's hard to hear 53 minutes where everything is about what Israel needs to do. And so the question is, when you have a conflict that's gone on for this long, and you have two parties to a conflict, is there anything that you would put on the table for a new administration that needs to be asked of the Palestinian side of this equation?
Yeah, tell us what you want. Because I don't think it's very easy to discern what Ramallah wants at the moment. Is what you want symbolic recognition of your existence as an occupied entity, keep the money flowing, keep the security cooperation flowing? Is what you want is to be a subcontractor for this reality, or do you want to change it? Because we don't, I'm often told I'm wrong on this. I'm probably often told I'm wrong on many things.
Well, I tell you, you're wrong about a lot of things. So that's
yeah. I feel one of the things that happened under the Obama administration is that he took his measure of who he was dealing with on both sides. And on the Abbas side, he felt this wasn't a guy who could go on a journey with him. And I fear that that's the case. So my ask from the Palestinians actually is, what is your strategy? Are you going to reassert agency? I don't want them to tell me again and again and again how much they accept us. We've heard it from them. I want them to tell me how they're going to disrupt the status quo in non-violent ways, in ways that challenge people. The biggest challenge that has come along was delivered on the Israeli side by Netanyahu. So when Netanyahu speaks about annexation, suddenly you have JIFNA, the Jewish Federation of North America, the AJC, the ADL, AIPAC, all scrambling and saying, we had everything exactly where we wanted it. Why are you making us go and bat for something that is more overtly apartheidist? We'll go and bat for it. Don't be under any illusions that we'll stand up for some kind of principle, but why are you doing this? It has Robert Satlov from WINIP saying, why are you doing this? The world's beginning to accept settlements. The Arab world is normalizing and we've kept Iran as the focus. So why disrupt that apple cart? My question to the Palestinians is, are you going to show us? And I realize this is hard and I realize the odds are stacked against them. And I realize that the owner shouldn't exclusively be on them. But I do think no one ever got their freedom because people identified with their plight. Normally people engage in a struggle. And I know that in civil society, there is a struggle. But the leadership position is almost incomprehensible today. And the division on the Palestinian side and the lack of democratic accountability and going back to their people, I think is debilitating for them. So that my critique vis-a-vis the Palestinian leadership is far from non-existent. It's pretty ruthless.
So we've ticked through 5 or 6 different pieces. I have one more to go. We've got about 3 minutes. And basically all of these have their flaws. They all have their strong points. And the question is, what can one put together as a coherent policy? And I hope that this conversation has helped people to at least think through the various different elements that we have to have on our radar. one that several people are raising in the Q&A, and that certainly I think you've been involved in, is what is referred to in Europe particularly as differentiation. And it is a policy that tries to say when the United States approaches the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, American policy should, and European policy should, distinguish and differentiate between what is within the Green Line and the part of the State of Israel and what is occupied and what is illegal. And it should have a different set of policies, whether it relates to businesses or to products or whatever. Differentiation has been a watchword for European policy. I'm curious if you think that is a direction that the United States should be leaning more into and consider putting a little bit more weight into.
Yeah, and I think this has to do with a lot more than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think differentiation is simply following international rules and norms that you would follow in other situations. And I think it doesn't do America a service, let alone an America that would be seeking to do a reset after the abominations of the last 3.5 years, to have some consistency in an approach. So, there has been a very concerted effort to fudge that line, actually on many sides, but I'm talking about the one in Congress to say that Israel and the territories it controls. So yes, I absolutely, and by the way, that is also, there are elements of the American approach that ostensibly lean in that direction, that the America does not consider. Trump may change that. Does not consider what goes on beyond the Green Line to be part of the bilateral relationship with an Israel that it recognizes only within the Green Line. I think it's part of the signaling. It's part of, it's also part of putting folks on the other side on the defensive, so that they don't come forward with demand after demand. I think it's an important distinction to draw. I want to close with one thing, if I may, Jeremy, which, I hope a Biden administration doesn't go back to the same old peace process, give aid to the Palestinians and try and get them back together. But I also think something has happened on this issue, which we have a particular responsibility to push back against. And that is the way in which anti-Semitism is being instrumentalized to silence Palestinian voices.
Yeah.
You can't have a situation in which, cognizant of where it's going with this on the ground, and cognizant of the horrible policies it's pursuing, Israel says, well, the best way we can defend ourselves against criticism is to try and silence and delegitimize and criminalize anyone who simply calls this out for what it is. And I think we have to really be at the forefront of standing up for those Palestinians to talk in their own terms, legitimately, about their own history, about their own experiences, and about their own aspirations. And I say that, at a time when, in many places, but certainly in your country, this attempt to draw an equivalence, this attempt to suggest that the outbreak of violent white nationalism that targets the Jewish community, and we know who the lead culprits are, and one has written a book that tries to draw this equivalence. And I think we have to be at the forefront of pushing back on that, of standing up for the legitimacy of that open debate, and for standing up for actual priorities when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism.
An excellent way to end. Really hope that this provoked a lot of thought from the folks who stuck with us for the hour and the folks who are going to watch it in retrospect. I know some people in the Q&A were saying they needed to watch it again in order to process all the topics that we covered. We did cover a lot of ground here, and I just want to say thank you, Daniel, for not only this hour, but for 15 years of partnership and friendship in this enterprise. And we will keep fighting for our values. We will keep fighting for a future that is better than this awful present that we have found ourselves in. And we'll find a different path in the 2020s, I'm positive.
Nice to talk to you in front of an audience, not just in our own private conversations, Jeremy.
All right. Thanks a lot, Daniel. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Happy 4th of July.
Oh, yes.